In the heart of Chicago, Illinois, a powerful mafia boss named Vincent ruled the underworld with an iron fist and a brilliant mind that no one dared challenge. For weeks, a coded message threatened to destroy his entire empire. 20 of the city's best cryptographers, hackers, and intelligence experts had failed to crack it. Time was running out, and Vincent's enemies were closing in. Then, on a rain-soaked Tuesday night, a young waitress named Aria walked into his private office with a coffee pot and a napkin. What she scribbled in 60 seconds would bring the most feared man in Chicago to his knees. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from. Vincent Marcello stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office on the 42nd floor of the Marcello Tower, watching the November rain streak down the glass like tears over the Chicago skyline. The city sprawled beneath him, a glittering maze of ambition and corruption, and he owned more of it than any elected official ever would. At 43, Vincent had built an empire that stretched from the docks of Lake Michigan to the backrooms of City Hall, an intricate web of legitimate businesses and shadow operations that made him untouchable, or so he had believed. He wore a charcoal Tom Ford suit that fit his athletic frame perfectly, the kind of tailored precision that spoke of wealth earned through ruthlessness. His dark hair, touched with gray at the temples, was combed back with pomade, and his steel-gray eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had made impossible decisions and slept soundly afterward. A thin scar ran along his left jawline, a souvenir from his youth in the South Side, a reminder that he had clawed his way up from nothing. The office itself was a study in controlled power. Dark mahogany furniture, leather chairs the color of dried blood, and abstract art that cost more than most people's homes. On his desk sat a crystal decanter of bourbon, untouched, and beside it, a manila envelope containing the coded message that had arrived 3 weeks ago. 20 experts had examined it. 20 had failed. Vincent's second-in-command, Marcus, stood near the door, a mountain of a man with hands that could crush bone but a mind sharp enough to run the organization's financial operations. The cryptographer from MIT just left, Marcus said, his voice a low rumble. Same result. He said the cipher system is unlike anything he's seen. It's not mathematical, not linguistic. He called it impossible. Nothing is impossible, Vincent said quietly, but even he heard the edge of doubt in his voice. The message had been delivered by a courier who died of a heart attack before they could question him. The envelope bore no return address, only Vincent's name written in elegant script. Inside, a single page covered in symbols that looked like a hybrid of ancient runes and modern circuitry. And at the bottom, in plain English, a single line. 7 days until your empire falls. Prove you deserve to keep it. That had been 21 days ago. Vincent had extended his own deadline through sheer force of will and strategic violence, eliminating 3 rival operations that might have sent the message. But the code remained unbroken, and whispers were spreading through the underworld. Vincent Marcello, the man who knew everything, couldn't solve a simple puzzle. Weakness was blood in the water, and the sharks were circling. His phone buzzed. Vincent glanced at the screen and saw a message from his sister, Elena, the only family he had left, and the only person whose opinion mattered. Dinner Sunday. Don't cancel again. He felt a pang of something he rarely allowed himself to feel. Guilt. Elena ran a nonprofit for at-risk youth in their old neighborhood, a life as far from his as possible. Yet she never judged him. She simply existed as a reminder of who he might have been. Vincent poured 2 fingers of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the light from the city below. The rain intensified, drumming against the windows like a warning. He thought about his father, dead 20 years now, who had told him that power wasn't about strength, but about knowing what others didn't. Information is the only currency that matters, Vince, the old man had said. Control information. Control everything. But what good was that philosophy when the information was locked behind a code he couldn't break? Marcus cleared his throat. There's something else. The Rossi family is making moves on the South Side. They think you're distracted. Vincent turned from the window, his face hardening into the mask that had made men confess secrets and beg for mercy, then remind them why distraction and weakness are not the same thing. Take Luca and handle it quietly. I don't want bodies. I want compliance. Understood. Marcus hesitated. And the code? I'll figure it out. Vincent's voice carried a certainty he didn't feel. After Marcus left, he sat at his desk and pulled the coded page from the envelope for the 100th time. The symbols seemed to mock him, dancing in patterns that his mind couldn't quite grasp. Circles within triangles, lines that intersected at strange angles, dots that might be punctuation or might be stars. One expert had suggested it was a map. Another thought it was musical notation. A third believed it was a psychological test, meaningless symbols designed to drive him mad. Vincent traced a finger over the paper, and for a moment, he thought he saw something. A rhythm, a repetition in the chaos. But then it slipped away, like trying to remember a dream upon waking. He slammed his hand on the desk, the sound sharp in the quiet office. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault, and somewhere in the city, his enemies were planning their next move. He thought about the waitress who worked at Rossetti's, the Italian restaurant on the ground floor of his building. Aria. He had noticed her 3 months ago, not because she was beautiful, though she was, with dark curls and eyes the color of warm honey, but because she moved through the chaos of the dinner rush with an unusual grace, as if she heard music no one else could. She never looked at him with fear or ambition, only a quiet curiosity that unsettled him. Vincent shook his head, dismissing the thought. A waitress had nothing to do with his world. He needed to focus. 7 days had become 21, but he could feel time running out. The message wasn't just a threat, it was a test. Someone wanted to prove he wasn't as smart as he believed. And if he failed, the empire he had built would crumble, and the streets of Chicago would run red with the blood of a succession war. He looked at the code again, and the symbols stared back, silent and inscrutable. The rain drummed on. The city glittered below, and Vincent Marcello, the man who controlled everything, felt control slipping through his fingers like water. The next morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of Chicago November day that seeped into your bones and refused to leave. Vincent had slept 3 hours, his dreams haunted by symbols that rearranged themselves into faces he didn't recognize. He woke at 5, ran 6 miles on the treadmill in his private gym, and stood under a scalding shower until his skin turned red, trying to wash away the frustration that clung to him like smoke. By 7, he was in his office. The coded message spread across his desk alongside reports from his various operations. The Rossi situation had been handled. Marcus had a conversation with their underboss that involved a baseball bat and a clear explanation of boundaries. No bodies, as requested, but the message was received. Vincent's empire remained intact, but he could feel the pressure building, like a storm gathering strength over the lake. His assistant, a sharp woman named Claire who had worked for him for 8 years and knew better than to ask questions, brought him espresso and a folder containing the day's agenda. You have a meeting with the alderman at 10, the accountants at noon, and the shipment from Detroit arrives at 3. Also, your sister called. She wants to confirm Sunday dinner. Tell her yes, Vincent said, scanning the reports without really seeing them. His mind kept returning to the code, to the impossible puzzle that 20 experts couldn't solve. He had built his reputation on being smarter than everyone else, on seeing patterns others missed. But this was different. It felt personal, like someone had reached into his mind and found the one thing that could break him, his pride. At 9:30, Marcus entered with a man Vincent didn't recognize, a thin, nervous individual with wire-rimmed glasses and the pale complexion of someone who spent too much time indoors. This is Dr. Raymond Chen, Marcus said. Cognitive psychologist from Northwestern, specializes in pattern recognition and problem solving. Vincent gestured to the chair across from his desk. You're expert number 21. What makes you different from the others? Dr. Chen sat, adjusting his glasses with trembling fingers. Vincent could smell his fear, sharp and acrid. Mr. Marcello, I've reviewed the notes from the previous analysts. They all approach this as a traditional cipher, mathematical, linguistic, or symbolic. But I believe they're wrong. This isn't a code meant to hide information. It's a psychological profile disguised as a puzzle. Vincent leaned back in his chair, intrigued despite himself. Explain. The symbols are too complex to be random, but too inconsistent to follow known cipher systems. However, if you look at the spatial relationships, how the symbols are positioned relative to each other, they form a kind of Rorschach test. The creator isn't asking you to decode a message. They're asking you to reveal how you think. Your approach to solving it tells them who you are. The room fell silent, except for the hum of the heating system and the distant sound of traffic 42 floors below. Vincent studied Dr. Chen, looking for deception or incompetence, but found only earnest belief. And what does my failure to solve it reveal? Dr. Chen swallowed hard, that you're trying to solve it like a businessman or a strategist, logically, methodically, by consulting experts. But the person who created this wants to see if you can think like an artist, or a child, or someone who sees the world differently than you do. They want to know if you're capable of changing your perspective. Vincent felt something shift in his chest, a hairline crack in the armor he wore. That's an interesting theory, Doctor, but it doesn't help me solve the damn thing. No, Dr. Chen admitted, but it might help you find someone who can. You need someone who doesn't think like you, someone whose mind works in patterns you don't understand, an outsider. After Dr. Chen left, with a generous payment and a warning never to speak of this meeting, Vincent sat alone with the code and the psychologist's words echoing in his mind. An outsider, someone who saw the world differently. He thought about the people in his organization, all of them trained to think like him, to anticipate his needs and mirror his methods. They were extensions of his will, useful but limited. His phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Looking forward to Sunday. I'm making lasagna. Bring wine, not excuses." He smiled despite himself. Elena was the only person who could make him feel like a younger brother instead of a crime lord. She lived in a small apartment in their old neighborhood, refusing his offers of money or a better place. "I don't want anything from your world, Vince," she had told him years ago. "But I'll always want you in mine." At noon, Vincent skipped the meeting with the accountants and did something he hadn't done in years. He left the tower without security and walked the streets of Chicago. The cold air bit at his face, and pedestrians hurried past, bundled in coats and scarves, anonymous and free in a way he would never be again. He walked without destination, letting his feet carry him through the loop, past the Art Institute and Millennium Park, where the bean reflected the gray sky in its polished surface. He found himself standing outside Rossetti's, the restaurant on the ground floor of his building. Through the window, he could see the lunch rush in full swing, waiters moving between tables with practiced efficiency. And there, carrying a tray of steaming plates, was Arya. She wore the standard black uniform, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and she was smiling at an elderly couple, saying something that made them laugh. Vincent watched her for a moment, remembering what he had noticed before, that unusual grace, as if she moved to a rhythm only she could hear. Dr. Chen's words came back to him, someone whose mind works in patterns you don't understand. He shook his head, dismissing the thought as desperation. A waitress couldn't solve what 20 experts had failed to crack, but as he turned to leave, Arya glanced toward the window and their eyes met. For a brief second, something passed between them. Recognition, curiosity, a question unasked. Then she looked away, returning to her work, and Vincent walked back to his tower, the cold rain beginning to fall once more. That evening, Marcus brought news that changed everything. "We found the courier's apartment, cleaned out, but forensics found something, a partial fingerprint on the envelope's seal. It matches someone in the system. A woman named Sophia Delacroix, former art forger, served time in Marion for counterfeiting, released 6 months ago." Vincent felt the pieces shifting, a pattern emerging from the chaos. An art forger, someone who understood symbols and visual language, who could create meaning from nothing. "Find her. I want to talk to her." Already on it. "But Vince, there's something else. The Delacroix woman? She's connected to the Moretti family. They've been quiet since you took over their territory 5 years ago, but this could be their play. Use the code to distract you while they rebuild." Vincent nodded slowly, his mind racing through scenarios and countermoves. If the Morettis were behind this, it wasn't just about the code. It was about revenge, about humiliation. They wanted him to fail publicly, to prove that Vincent Marcello could be beaten, and they had chosen the perfect weapon. His own intelligence turned against him. He returned to his office and stared at the coded message with new eyes. An art forger would think in terms of composition, balance, visual rhythm. The symbols weren't random. They were arranged like a painting, with focal points and negative space. He tried to see it that way, to let his analytical mind relax and simply observe. For a moment, he thought he glimpsed something, a face hidden in the symbols, or maybe a map of the city. But then it dissolved, leaving only frustration. Vincent poured another bourbon and stood at the window, watching the rain fall on Chicago. Somewhere out there, Sophia Delacroix was laughing at him. Somewhere, his enemies were planning their next move. And somewhere, a waitress named Arya was finishing her shift, unaware that she had caught the attention of the most dangerous man in the city. The rain drummed against the glass, relentless and cold, and Vincent felt the weight of his crown pressing down, heavier than it had ever been. He had built an empire on certainty, on always being the smartest person in the room. But now, for the first time in years, he wasn't sure he could win, and that uncertainty was more terrifying than any threat he had ever faced. Sophia Delacroix was found 3 days later in a loft in Pilsen, surrounded by canvases and the sharp smell of turpentine. Marcus and 2 of Vincent's men brought her to the tower at midnight, and she walked into his office with the confidence of someone who had been expecting the invitation. She was in her 50s, with silver hair cut short and paint-stained fingers that moved constantly, as if sketching invisible pictures in the air. "Mr. Marcello," she said, her voice carrying a faint French accent. "I wondered how long it would take you to find me." Vincent gestured to the chair across from his desk, the same chair where 21 experts had sat and failed. "You created the code. I created the art," she corrected, settling into the chair with the ease of someone who had faced worse than a mafia boss. "Whether it's a code or not depends on how you look at it. That was the point. The Morettis hired you." Sophia smiled, a thin expression that didn't reach her eyes. "The Morettis are small-minded fools who think revenge is about violence. No, Mr. Marcello, I wasn't hired. I volunteered. You destroyed someone I cared about 5 years ago when you took over their territory. A man named Thomas Moretti. He was an artist, like me. He saw beauty in this ugly city, and you crushed him because he was in your way." Vincent remembered Thomas Moretti, a mid-level operator in the old family structure, someone who had resisted the transition of power. Vincent had given him a choice: leave Chicago or face consequences. Thomas had chosen to stay, and Vincent had made an example of him. Not violence, but complete financial ruin. A dismantling so thorough that Thomas had disappeared from the city entirely. Vincent had thought it merciful compared to the alternative. "So this is personal," Vincent said quietly. "You want revenge. I want you to understand what it feels like to have your identity stripped away," Sophia replied. "You pride yourself on being intelligent, on solving problems others can't. I wanted to create something that would break that pride, that would show you that intelligence isn't the same as wisdom, and power isn't the same as understanding." Vincent leaned forward, his steel-gray eyes locked on hers. "Then explain it to me. Solve your own puzzle." Sophia laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "That would defeat the purpose, wouldn't it? The code isn't meant to be solved by someone like me. It's meant to be solved by someone who sees the world without your filters, without your assumptions. Someone innocent." She paused, studying him with an artist's eye. "You've consulted experts, people who think like you, but the answer won't come from expertise. It will come from simplicity, from a mind uncorrupted by your world." "Riddles," Vincent said, his voice hard. "You're wasting my time." "Am I?" Sophia stood, moving to the window where Vincent had stood so many times, looking out at the city. "The Morettis are making their move, Mr. Marcello. They've been rebuilding in the shadows while you've been obsessed with my little art project. In 3 days, they're going to hit your operations on the south side, your shipping routes, and your political connections simultaneously. They're going to take everything you've built, piece by piece. And you've been too distracted to see it coming." Vincent felt ice flood his veins. He glanced at Marcus, who pulled out his phone and started making calls, his face grim. "You're lying," Vincent said, but he could hear the doubt in his own voice. "I'm an artist, not a liar," Sophia said. "The code was never the real threat. It was the distraction. While you've been trying to prove how smart you are, your enemies have been preparing for war. And now it's too late to stop them." She turned from the window, her expression almost pitying. "You asked me to solve the puzzle. Here's the solution. The puzzle was never about the symbols on the page. It was about whether you could see past your own ego long enough to recognize the real danger. You failed." Vincent stood, his hands flat on the desk, every muscle in his body coiled with barely contained rage. "Marcus, take her to the holding room. I'll decide what to do with her later." As Marcus escorted Sophia out, she looked back at Vincent one last time. "There's still a way to solve it, you know. The code. But you'll have to let go of everything you think you know. You'll have to trust someone you have no reason to trust. Can you do that, Mr. Marcello?" And the great Vincent Marcello admit he needs help from someone beneath him. The door closed, and Vincent was alone with the coded message and the weight of Sophia's words. He pulled up the intelligence reports on his computer, cross-referencing with Marcus's network of informants. It took 20 minutes to confirm what Sophia had told him. The Morettis had been moving in the shadows, rebuilding their organization, making alliances with families in Detroit and Milwaukee. And in 3 days, they were planning a coordinated strike that would cripple his empire. Vincent had been so focused on the code that he had missed the larger picture. Sophia was right. The puzzle had been a distraction, a way to occupy his mind while his enemies prepared for war. But she was also wrong about one thing. It wasn't too late. Vincent had built his empire by being ruthless and adaptable, by seeing threats before they materialized. He had been distracted, yes, but he wasn't defeated. He called an emergency meeting of his top lieutenants for dawn. They would fortify the South Side operations, reroute the shipping schedules, and activate their contacts in law enforcement to put pressure on the Morettis. Vincent would turn defense into offense, striking at the Moretti family's weak points before they could execute their plan. It would be brutal and costly, but he would survive. He always did. But as he planned and strategized, a part of his mind kept returning to the code, to Sophia's final words. There's still a way to solve it. Trust someone you have no reason to trust. Someone innocent. Someone who sees the world without your filters. At 3 a.m, with the city dark and silent below, Vincent found himself thinking about Arya again, the waitress who moved with unusual grace, who had looked at him through the window with curiosity instead of fear. It was absurd, the idea that she could solve what 21 experts couldn't. But Dr. Chen had said the same thing. You need someone who doesn't think like you. Vincent rubbed his eyes, exhaustion finally catching up with him. He had 48 hours to prepare for the Moretti attack, to shore up his defenses and plan his counterstrikes. The code didn't matter anymore. It had served its purpose as a distraction, and now he knew the real threat. He should forget about it, focus on the war that was coming. But he couldn't, because Sophia had been right about one thing. His pride had been wounded. The code represented a failure, a problem he couldn't solve, and that failure gnawed at him like a wound that wouldn't heal. He had built his identity on being smarter than everyone else, and the code had proven him wrong. Vincent looked at the symbols one more time, and in his exhaustion they seemed to shift and rearrange themselves, forming patterns that almost made sense. Circles within triangles, lines intersecting at strange angles, dots that might be stars or tears, or simply marks on a page. He thought about Thomas Moretti, the man Sophia had loved, the artist who had seen beauty in an ugly city. What would an artist see in these symbols? What would someone innocent see? The rain had stopped, and the first hints of dawn were touching the eastern sky, turning it from black to deep blue. Vincent stood at the window, watching the city wake up, and made a decision that surprised him. He would prepare for war with the Morettis, but he would also solve the code, not because it mattered strategically, but because he needed to prove to himself that he could, that his mind was still sharp, still capable of seeing what others missed. And to do that, he would need help from someone who saw the world differently, someone innocent, someone like a waitress named Arya, who moved through chaos with grace and looked at him without fear. Vincent picked up his phone and sent a message to Claire. Tomorrow evening, have the waitress from Rossetti's brought to my office, the one with dark curls. Her name is Arya. Make it an invitation, not a summons. Tell her I need her help with something important. He set the phone down and returned to his war plans, pushing thoughts of the code aside. But in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that Sophia's puzzle might be more important than he realized, that the real test wasn't about solving symbols on a page, but about whether he could change, whether he could become something more than the ruthless machine he had built himself into. Outside, the sun rose over Chicago, cold and distant, and Vincent Marcello prepared for the battle that would determine whether his empire survived or fell. The next 48 hours were a blur of violence and strategy. Vincent mobilized his entire organization, calling in favors from politicians and police commanders, moving money and resources to fortify his operations on the South Side. Marcus led a preemptive strike on a Moretti warehouse, sending a message that Vincent knew they were coming. 3 of the Moretti underbosses were arrested on fabricated charges, their operations disrupted just enough to slow their momentum. But the cost was high. 2 of Vincent's men were killed in a shootout near the docks. A shipment of merchandise was seized by the FBI, likely tipped off by Moretti informants. And worst of all, Vincent's alderman contact, a man who had been in his pocket for 5 years, suddenly announced his retirement, leaving a power vacuum in City Hall that the Morettis would rush to fill. By the evening of the second day, Vincent stood in his office, surrounded by reports of losses and gains, feeling the weight of the Empire pressing down on him like a physical force. He had blunted the Moretti attack, but he hadn't stopped it. The war was just beginning, and he could feel his control slipping, piece by piece, like sand through his fingers. Marcus entered, his face grim. The Morettis hit our shipping route in Gary, burned 3 trucks, killed the drivers. They're not playing anymore, Vince. This is all-out war. Vincent nodded slowly, his mind calculating casualties and counter-moves. Double the security on all routes. I want armed escorts, GPS tracking, and backup teams within 5 minutes of every shipment. And find out who their informant is in our organization. Someone is feeding them information. Already on it. Marcus hesitated. There's something else. Your sister called. She's worried about you. Said you haven't returned her messages. Vincent felt a stab of guilt. In the chaos of the past 2 days, he had forgotten about Sunday dinner. Forgotten about Elena entirely. She was the one pure thing in his life. The reminder that he was still human beneath the armor. And he had let her down. Tell her I'll call her tonight. She said if you don't show up Sunday, she's coming here. And you know she will. Vincent almost smiled despite the circumstances. Elena had never been afraid of him, even when he was at his most dangerous. She would march into his tower, past his security, and drag him out by the ear if she thought he needed it. I'll be there. I promise. After Marcus left, Vincent sat at his desk and stared at the coded message, still spread out where it had been for weeks. In the midst of war and chaos, the symbols seemed almost peaceful, a puzzle disconnected from the violence consuming his world. He thought about Sophia Delacroix, locked in a holding room 3 floors below, and her words echoed in his mind. You'll have to trust someone you have no reason to trust. At 7 o'clock, Claire knocked on his door. Mr. Marcello, your guest is here. Vincent looked up, momentarily confused, and then remembered. Aria. He had asked Claire to invite the waitress to his office, a decision that seemed absurd now, in the middle of a war. He should cancel, focus on the Morettis, on survival. But something made him nod. Send her in. Aria entered the office with the same grace he had noticed before, but up close, he could see the wariness in her honey-colored eyes. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her dark curls loose around her shoulders, and she looked around the office with open curiosity, taking in the expensive furniture and the view of the city. Mr. Marcello, she said, her voice soft but steady. Your assistant said you needed help with something important. I have to admit, I'm confused. I'm just a waitress. Vincent gestured to the chair across from his desk, the chair where so many experts had failed. Please, sit, and call me Vincent. I know this seems strange, but I need a fresh perspective on something, and I think you might be able to help. Aria sat, her hands folded in her lap, and Vincent could see her mind working, trying to understand why a man like him would ask for help from someone like her. Okay, she said slowly. What do you need? Vincent picked up the coded message and handed it to her. I need you to look at this and tell me what you see. Aria took the paper, her eyes scanning the symbols. Vincent watched her face, looking for confusion or frustration, but instead he saw concentration, a kind of focused attention that reminded him of someone listening to music. She tilted her head, turned the paper sideways, then upside down. A minute passed in silence. It's beautiful, she said finally, like a constellation or a map of something that doesn't exist yet. Can you read it? Vincent asked, leaning forward despite himself. Read it? No, I don't think it's meant to be read. It's meant to be felt. Aria looked up at him, and in her eyes, he saw something he hadn't expected. Understanding. This is about loss, isn't it? Someone made this because they lost something important, and they want you to understand what that feels like. Vincent felt something crack inside him, a wall he had built years ago suddenly showing fissures. How do you know that? Aria set the paper on the desk and traced one of the symbols with her finger. Because I've felt it too. When my father died 3 years ago, I couldn't talk about it, couldn't explain the emptiness, so I started drawing, just shapes and lines, trying to make sense of it. This reminds me of those drawings. It's not a code, it's a language of grief. Vincent sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. A language of grief. Sophia had created the symbols not to hide information, but to express what she felt when Thomas Moretti was destroyed. And she had sent it to Vincent because she wanted him to feel that same loss, that same helplessness. The code wasn't meant to be solved. It was meant to be experienced. But there's something else, Aria continued, still studying the paper. See how some of the symbols repeat, like this circle with a line through it, and this triangle with dots inside. They're scattered throughout, but they form a pattern, like a heartbeat. If you connect them, she picked up a pen from Vincent's desk and began drawing lines between the repeating symbols, her hand moving with surprising confidence. Vincent watched as the lines formed a shape, something that emerged from the chaos of symbols, like a figure stepping out of fog. It was a face, crude but recognizable, a man's face, with sad eyes and a gentle expression. Thomas Moretti. Sophia had hidden his portrait in the code, a memorial disguised as a puzzle. There, Arya said, setting down the pen. That's what she wanted you to see. Not a message, but a person. Someone who mattered. Vincent stared at the drawing, at the face of the man he had destroyed without a second thought, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Shame. Not regret for the action itself. He had done what was necessary to build his empire, but shame for not seeing Thomas as a person, for reducing him to an obstacle to be removed. Sophia's code had forced him to confront that, to see the human cost of his choices. Thank you, Vincent said quietly, his voice rough. You solved in 1 minute what 20 experts couldn't solve in 3 weeks. Arya looked at him with those honey-colored eyes, and he saw compassion there, not judgment. They couldn't solve it because they were looking for information. But this wasn't about information. It was about connection, about making you see someone you refused to see. Vincent nodded, unable to speak. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't been since he was a child in the South Side, before he learned to build walls and wear masks. Arya had seen through the code, and in doing so, had seen through him. Can I ask you something? Arya said. Why did you bring me here? You could have asked anyone to look at this. Vincent met her gaze and told her the truth. Because you see the world differently than I do. And I needed to remember that there are other ways of seeing, other ways of being. I've spent so long being one thing that I forgot there were other possibilities. Arya smiled, a small, sad expression. My father used to say that the hardest thing in life is changing who you are, but it's also the only thing worth doing. Before Vincent could respond, his phone buzzed with an urgent message from Marcus. Morettis are moving tonight. Southside Warehouse. We need you now. Vincent stood, the moment of vulnerability passing as quickly as it had come. I have to go. Thank you for your help, Arya. You've given me more than you know. Arya stood as well, and as she moved toward the door, she paused and looked back at him. Whatever you're facing, Vincent, remember that strength isn't just about power. Sometimes it's about knowing when to let go. Then she was gone, and Vincent was alone with the coded message and the face of Thomas Moretti staring up at him from the page. He had solved the puzzle, but the solution had only raised more questions. What did it mean to let go? What did it mean to change? He didn't have time to answer those questions. The Morettis were moving, and he had a war to fight. But as he left his office and descended to the garage where Marcus waited with armed men and grim determination, Vincent carried Arya's words with him like a talisman, and for the first time in years, he wondered if there was more to life than the empire he had built, more to himself than the ruthless machine he had become. The night was cold and clear, the stars hidden by the city's lights, and Vincent Marcello went to war, knowing that win or lose, he had already been changed by a waitress who saw the world differently, who had solved his impossible puzzle with compassion instead of logic, with heart instead of mind. The warehouse on the south side was a concrete fortress, one of Vincent's key distribution centers, and the Morettis had chosen it for maximum impact. Marcus had intelligence that they were planning to hit it at midnight with a force of 20 men, armed and ready to burn it to the ground. Vincent arrived with 15 of his best, including Luca, a former Marine who had saved his life twice, and Tony, a strategist who could read a battlefield like a chessboard. They set up defensive positions inside the warehouse, using the stacked crates and machinery as cover, and waited. Vincent stood near the main entrance, a Glock in his hand, feeling the familiar weight of violence settling over him like a second skin. This was his world, the place where he had always been most comfortable, making hard decisions, facing threats head-on, surviving through force and will. But tonight, something felt different. As he waited in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of the city, Vincent's mind kept returning to the coded message, to Thomas Moretti's face hidden in the symbols, to Arya's words about letting go. He had spent his entire adult life building this empire, sacrificing everything, relationships, morality, peace, for power. And now, standing in a warehouse waiting for a war he didn't want, he wondered if it had been worth it. At 11:47, the Morettis arrived. Vincent heard the vehicles before he saw them. 3 SUVs pulling up outside, doors opening, footsteps on concrete. Marcus signaled from his position near the west entrance, confirming the count. 22 men, heavily armed. The Morettis weren't taking chances. Vincent's phone vibrated with a call from an unknown number. He answered, keeping his voice low. Yes? Mr. Marcello. It was a voice he didn't recognize, smooth and confident. This is Anthony Moretti. I believe you're expecting us. I'm here, Vincent replied. You want to talk, or you want to die? Anthony laughed, a sound without humor. I want you to understand something. This isn't about territory or money. This is about respect. You destroyed my Uncle Thomas 5 years ago, treated him like he was nothing. Sophia Delacroix showed us that you're not invincible, that you can be distracted, manipulated. Tonight we take back what you stole, and we do it in his name. Vincent felt anger flare in his chest, but beneath it was something else. Understanding. The Morettis weren't just fighting for power. They were fighting for family, for memory, for the same things that made him visit his sister every Sunday. Thomas made his choice, Vincent said. He could have left. I gave him that option. You gave him the choice between his home and his life, Anthony shot back. That's not a choice. That's cruelty. And tonight, you'll understand what it feels like to lose everything. The line went dead. Vincent looked at Marcus and nodded. The war was starting. The Morettis came in fast and hard, breaching both entrances simultaneously with flashbangs and automatic weapons fire. The warehouse erupted into chaos, the sound of gunfire deafening in the enclosed space, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like lightning. Vincent moved on instinct, firing at shadows, coordinating his men through hand signals and shouted commands. Luca took down 3 Moretti soldiers in the first 30 seconds, his Marine training evident in every movement. Tony directed fire from the elevated platform, using the high ground to devastating effect. But the Morettis had numbers and momentum, pushing deeper into the warehouse, forcing Vincent's men back toward the rear exit. Vincent felt a bullet graze his shoulder, a line of fire across his skin, but he kept moving, kept fighting. He saw one of his men, a kid named Danny, barely 22, go down with a chest wound, and Vincent dragged him behind cover, applying pressure to the wound even as bullets chewed up the concrete around them. Stay with me, Vincent said, but he could see the light fading from Danny's eyes, could feel the life draining away beneath his hands. Danny died 30 seconds later, and Vincent felt something break inside him. This kid had worked for him for 2 years, loyal and eager, and now he was gone. Another casualty in a war that suddenly seemed pointless. How many more would die tonight? How many more lives would be sacrificed for Vincent's empire? Marcus appeared beside him, reloading his weapon. We can't hold them much longer. We need to fall back, regroup. Vincent looked around the warehouse, at his men fighting and bleeding, at the Morettis pressing forward with relentless determination. He thought about Aria's words. Sometimes strength is about knowing when to let go. And he thought about Thomas Moretti's face in the code, a reminder that every action had consequences, that every choice left scars. No, Vincent said, making a decision that surprised even himself. We're not falling back. We're ending this. He stood up, exposing himself to enemy fire, and shouted loud enough to be heard over the gunfire. Anthony Moretti, I want to talk. The shooting slowed, then stopped, an eerie silence falling over the warehouse. Vincent walked toward the center of the space, his hands raised, the Glock hanging loose at his side. Marcus hissed a warning, but Vincent ignored him. This was something he had to do. Anthony Moretti stepped out from behind a stack of crates, flanked by 4 of his men, all with weapons trained on Vincent. He was younger than Vincent expected, maybe 30, with his uncle's sad eyes and a face hardened by loss. You want to talk now? After all this? I want to end this, Vincent said. Not with more death, but with truth. You're right. I destroyed your uncle. I didn't see him as a person, just an obstacle. And I'm sorry for that. Sophia's code taught me something. It taught me that I've been so focused on building my empire that I forgot the cost, forgot the people I hurt along the way. Anthony's expression didn't change. An apology doesn't bring him back. No, it doesn't. But more killing won't either. Your uncle was an artist, someone who saw beauty in this city. Do you think he would want this? Would want you to die in a warehouse fighting over territory that doesn't matter? It matters to me, Anthony said, his voice breaking slightly. He was all I had. Vincent lowered his hands, taking a step closer despite the weapons pointed at him. I know what it's like to lose family. My parents are dead. My sister is the only person I have left who reminds me I'm human. And if I lost her, I'd want revenge too. I'd want to burn the world down. But your uncle wouldn't want that for you. He'd want you to live, to create, to be better than this. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Vincent could see the conflict in Anthony's eyes, the war between grief and reason, between revenge and survival. And then, slowly, Anthony lowered his weapon. What are you proposing? Anthony asked. A truce. You keep your operations in the neighborhoods you've rebuilt. I keep mine. We establish clear boundaries, and we respect them. No more war, no more killing. We honor your uncle's memory by choosing peace instead of violence. Anthony looked at his men, then back at Vincent. And if I say no, then we all die here tonight, Vincent said simply. You'll kill me. My men will kill you. And the Morettis and the Marcellos will destroy each other in a war that benefits no one. Or we can choose differently. We can be better than what this city expects us to be. For a long moment, Anthony Moretti stood frozen, and Vincent could see the decision being made behind his eyes. Then, finally, he nodded. A truce. But if you cross the boundaries, if you come into our territory, the war starts again. Agreed, Vincent said, extending his hand. Anthony hesitated, then shook it, and Vincent felt the tension drain from the warehouse like water from a broken dam. The Morettis withdrew, carrying their wounded, and Vincent's men did the same. The war was over, not with victory or defeat, but with a choice to stop fighting. As the warehouse emptied, Marcus approached Vincent, his face a mixture of confusion and respect. I don't understand. We could have won. We could have ended the Morettis tonight. At what cost? Vincent asked, looking at Danny's body being carried out by Luca and Tony. How many more kids like him would have died? How many more families destroyed? I built this empire on violence, Marcus. But maybe it's time to build something different. Something that doesn't require so much blood. Marcus nodded slowly. You've changed, Vince. I don't know if that's good or bad, but you've definitely changed. Vincent thought about Arya, about the way she had looked at the coded message and seen grief instead of information, connection instead of strategy. Maybe change is the only thing that matters, he said. They left the warehouse as dawn began to touch the eastern sky, turning it from black to gray to pale blue. Vincent's shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, and his hands were still stained with Danny's blood, but he felt lighter than he had in years, as if a weight he hadn't known he was carrying had been lifted. He thought about Sunday dinner with Elena, about sitting in her small apartment and eating lasagna, and pretending for a few hours that he was just a brother instead of a crime lord. And he thought about Arya, the waitress who had solved his impossible puzzle, and, in doing so, had shown him a different way of being. The sun rose over Chicago, cold and beautiful, and Vincent Marcello drove back to his tower, knowing that his empire would never be the same. He had chosen peace over victory, humanity over power, and that choice had cost him something he couldn't quite name, but it had also given him something back, a glimpse of the person he might have been, the person he might still become. Sunday arrived with unexpected warmth, a brief reprieve from Chicago's November cold. Vincent woke in his penthouse, his shoulder bandaged and aching, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't immediately check his phone for threats or reports. Instead, he stood at the window and watched the city wake up, the streets filling with people going about their lives, unaware of the war that had almost consumed them. He thought about the coded message, still on his desk, and Thomas Moretti's face hidden in the symbols. Sophia Delacroix had been released the previous day, her mission accomplished. She had wanted Vincent to understand loss, to feel what she felt when Thomas was destroyed, and in a strange way, she had succeeded. The code had been a mirror, forcing him to see himself clearly for the first time in years. At noon, Vincent drove to Elena's apartment in the South Side, the neighborhood where they had grown up. The streets were familiar, but changed, gentrified in some areas, still struggling in others. Elena's building was a modest 3-story walk-up, and Vincent climbed the stairs with a bottle of expensive wine and a sense of anticipation he hadn't felt in a long time. Elena opened the door before he could knock, her face lighting up with a smile that reminded him of their mother. She was 5 years younger than Vincent, with the same dark hair and gray eyes, but where his face had hardened with violence and power. Hers had softened with compassion and purpose. "You actually came," she said, pulling him into a hug. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten you had a sister." "Never," Vincent said, returning the embrace. "I'm sorry I've been distant. Work has been complicated." "Work is always complicated for you," Elena said, leading him into the small apartment. The smell of lasagna filled the space, rich and comforting, and Vincent felt something in his chest loosen. This was home, not the penthouse with its expensive furniture and city views, but this small apartment where his sister lived a life of meaning and purpose. They ate at the tiny kitchen table, and Elena told him about her nonprofit, about the kids she was helping, the programs she was developing. Vincent listened, genuinely interested, and realized how much of her life he had missed by being consumed with his empire. She was doing real good in the world, making a tangible difference, while he had spent years accumulating power that ultimately meant nothing. "You seem different," Elena said, studying him over her wine glass. "Something's changed." Vincent set down his fork and told her everything. The coded message, the 21 experts, the war with the Morettis, and Arya, the waitress who had solved the puzzle in 60 seconds. He told her about Danny dying in his arms, about the choice he had made to end the war instead of winning it, about the realization that his empire had cost him more than it had given him. Elena listened without interruption, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm proud of you, Vince. Not for building your empire, but for having the courage to question it, to choose differently. That's the hardest thing anyone can do." "I don't know what comes next," Vincent admitted. "I've spent my entire adult life being one thing. I don't know how to be anything else." "You don't have to figure it all out today," Elena said. "Change doesn't happen overnight. But you've taken the first step, and that's what matters. You saw yourself clearly, and you didn't like what you saw, so you chose to be better. That's all any of us can do." They spent the rest of the afternoon talking, really talking, in a way they hadn't since they were children. Vincent told her about their father, about the lessons he had learned and the ones he wished he could unlearn. Elena told him about her fears for the neighborhood, about the kids who reminded her of Vincent at that age, angry and brilliant and desperate for a way out. "I want to help," Vincent said suddenly. "Your nonprofit. I want to fund it, properly. Not just a donation, but real support. Enough to expand, to reach more kids, to make a real difference." Elena looked at him with surprise, and something that might have been hope. "You're serious?" "I've made a lot of money doing things I'm not proud of," Vincent said. "Maybe it's time to use some of it for something good. Let me do this, Elena. Let me help you help them." Elena's eyes filled with tears, and she squeezed his hand. "Okay, but on one condition. You have to be involved. Not just writing checks, but actually showing up, meeting the kids, being present. They need to see that people can change, that there's more than one path forward." Vincent nodded, feeling something shift inside him, a foundation being laid for a different kind of empire. "I can do that." As the sun set over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Vincent left Elena's apartment and drove back to his tower. But instead of going to his office, he went to Rossetti's, the restaurant on the ground floor. It was the dinner rush, and Arya was there, moving through the chaos with her usual grace. Vincent waited until her shift ended at 9, and when she emerged from the kitchen, still in her uniform, he was standing by the door. She saw him and smiled, a genuine expression that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he could be someone different. "Vincent," she said, "I didn't expect to see you here. I wanted to thank you," he said, "for solving the code, but more than that, for showing me a different way of seeing. You changed something in me, Arya. You made me question everything I thought I knew." Arya tilted her head, studying him with those honey-colored eyes. "I just looked at some symbols and told you what I saw. You're the one who chose to listen, who chose to change. That was all you." "Maybe," Vincent said, "but I couldn't have done it without you. And I was wondering, would you have dinner with me sometime? Not as a favor, not as part of my world, but just as two people who see things differently and might have something to learn from each other." Arya's smile widened. "I'd like that, but on one condition. We go somewhere normal. No fancy restaurants, no penthouses, just a regular place where regular people eat." Vincent laughed, a sound he hadn't made in years. "Deal. I know a great pizza place in Little Italy. Nothing fancy, Just good food and honest people. Perfect, Arya said. It's a date. As Vincent walked back to his tower, he felt the coded message in his pocket. He had brought it with him, unable to leave it behind. He pulled it out and looked at Thomas Moretti's face one more time, at the symbols that had nearly destroyed him and ultimately saved him. Sophia had wanted him to understand loss, to feel grief, and he did. But she had also given him something unexpected, a chance to change, to become something more than the ruthless machine he had built himself into. Vincent reached his office and stood at the window, looking out at the city he had controlled for so long. The lights glittered below, each one representing a life, a story, a person he had never bothered to see. He thought about Danny, about Thomas Moretti, about all the people who had been casualties in his pursuit of power. And he made a promise to himself. No more. No more treating people as obstacles or assets. No more sacrificing humanity for empire. He took out his phone and called Marcus. I need you to set up a meeting with the heads of all our operations. Tomorrow morning. We're making changes. What kind of changes? Marcus asked, his voice wary. The kind that matter, Vincent said. We're going to start running things differently. Less violence, more legitimacy. I want to transition our operations into legal businesses over the next 5 years. Real estate, technology, legitimate shipping. We're going to build something that doesn't require blood to maintain. Marcus was silent for a long moment. That's going to be difficult. A lot of people won't like it. I know, Vincent said. But it's necessary. I've spent too long building an empire on violence and fear. It's time to build something better. Something that lasts. Are you with me? Another pause, then. I'm with you, Vince. Always have been. Vincent ended the call and set the coded message on his desk, next to the photo of his parents that he kept hidden in a drawer. He looked at the 3 faces, his mother's kind smile, his father's stern expression, and Thomas Moretti's sad eyes, and felt the weight of the past settling over him like a cloak. But it wasn't a burden anymore. It was a foundation, a reminder of where he had come from and where he was going. The rain began to fall again, soft and steady, washing the city clean. Vincent stood at the window and watched it come down, thinking about Arya and Elena, about the kids in the South Side who needed a different path, about the empire he was going to transform. It would take years, maybe decades, and he would face resistance from his own people and from the other families who profited from the old ways. But Vincent Marcello had built an empire through intelligence and ruthlessness, and now he would rebuild it through wisdom and compassion. He had fallen to his knees when Arya solved the code in 60 seconds, not because she had beaten him, but because she had shown him what he had been missing all along. That true strength wasn't about power or control, but about connection, about seeing others as people instead of obstacles, about choosing to be better even when it was harder. The city glittered below, beautiful and broken, and Vincent made a silent promise to Thomas Moretti, to Danny, to all the people he had hurt in his climb to the top. He would do better. He would be better. And maybe, just maybe, he would build something that actually mattered, something that would last long after he was gone. The rain drummed against the windows, a rhythm like a heartbeat, and Vincent Marcello stood in his tower, no longer the ruthless crime lord who controlled Chicago through fear, but a man who had been changed by a waitress's compassion, a sister's love, and a coded message that had forced him to see himself clearly for the first time in his life. He had fallen to his knees, and in falling, he had found a way to stand again, not as a king of shadows, but as a man trying to be worthy of the second chance he had been given. And that, he realized, was the real solution to Sophia's puzzle. Not the symbols on the page, but the choice to change, to let go of who he had been, and become who he might be. The empire would survive, but it would be different. He would be different. And that difference, small as it was, felt like the most important thing he had ever built. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more compelling narratives. Drop a comment below and let me know which moment resonated with you the most. Was it Vincent's realization in the warehouse, Arya's simple wisdom, or the final choice to rebuild his empire on different foundations? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, remember that change is always possible, no matter how far we've fallen.